in the book of Revelation. And so Apocalypse Revealed was one of the first books I really dove into. And and yet and yet there's so much to engage when you look at a serious study of something like the New Century Edition was supposed to be a library edition. It was supposed to be a scholar's edition with footnotes and an introductory article by a scholar. So to get ready for it, I taught a couple of classes on the history of interpretation of the apocalypse. The literal Greek word in the book of Revelation is apocalypsis. And apocalypse actually means unveiling, to reveal something. A lot of folks tend to, because of the book of Revelation, tend to think apocalypse means Armageddon, but it's not a synonym with Armageddon. It simply means an unveiling, a revealing of something. And I taught a class called Apocalypse Then and Now, in which I barely mention Swedenborg at all and do not devote even part of a session to Swedenborg, even though he appears in the syllabus as part of the readings, because I wanted to understand the interpretation history of the book of Revelation before, as I got ready to really engage what Swedenborg dealt with. And so in terms of Swedenborg's dealings with the book of Revelation, many of us know that it ended up being presenting one of the biggest mysteries in Swedenborgian publishing. I'll come back to that. Big Swedenborg puzzle is that Swedenborg wrote, 6 volumes called Apocalypsis Explicata that he had completely ready for the printer. It was so that he had gone through his manuscripts and had been writing out a fair copy as he went along, as he got towards the end, and it was nearly done, but then never published. And there's a big mystery. Why did he never publish it? He ends up publishing 2 volumes. If you compare the 2 sets of writings on the book of Revelation, it's fascinating to see that Swedenborg did not repeat very much language. Swedenborg started keeping notebooks on his writings, or his famous indexing system, as he began the Arcana, which he continued his whole writing career. One reason why Swedenborg is so consistent in the writings is because he was constantly pulling forward his commentaries that he had previously used. So there's a tremendous amount of repurposed language. There's a database that scholars have done in the general church to be able to locate how often Swedenborg reuses language in the later works that had been stated either identically or nearly identically previously. Fascinatingly, their Apocalypse Explained and Apocalypse Revealed are both on the book of Revelation, and there is nearly 0 repeated language in terms of any kind of sentences being carried forward. So why did he set the Apocalypsis Explicata aside? I think this helps us get into the deep purpose of this part of the word, this part of the Bible, as a Swedenborgian community, for whom this particular book in the canon has played a very central role in our identity and discourse over time. Now, it fascinated me to discover that there had never been a study by anybody on why the Explicata was set aside. What were his reasons? There's not a single study in any of the branches on why it was set aside. There are a few brief surmises that exist. There's 5 or 6 single comments that I could find, but there's not a published discussion about any of those surmises. And the only surmise that got mentioned more than once is that, well, the project was getting too unwieldy. It was getting kind of big, and that's kind of humorous for me to reflect back on at this point, because like when was that ever a problem for Swedenborg being kind of a large, massive study? There's some clues though when you do set this two side by side and do a comparative study about why there was this dramatic reversal to set aside that he had put so much time and effort in, and then come back to the project later and have a very different approach. Well, here's three big clues. One is that the phrase new church is increases 800% in terms of times of use in the later work compared to the earlier work. The earlier work primarily talks about the universal church. It's constantly kind of a perspective on what are the deep spiritual formation values in the universal church. The later work focuses excessively on the new church as a new movement, and that's connected to the second clue. The second clue is that the last judgment evolves from a general doctrine idea to an accomplished fact in the later work. You can go hundreds of pages in Apocalypse Explained and not see the last judgment referred to at all, which is a little odd when you think about the years, because he claims that he witnessed the last judgment in 1757, that it went on almost entirely for the calendar year of 1757. And then we know that he's rapidly finishing the Arcana. He begins galloping at a fast pace. The last time he takes a book to press is 1756 for the Arcana. And my theory is that even though it looked like and just in terms of why he was galloping to finish Exodus, which is the second book in the Arcana that he goes first by biblical book, Genesis then Exodus, is that when he begins the Arcana, he indicates he's going to show the inner sense of the whole word. But it took him 8 years to do the books that we do have in the Arcana, and there was no way he was going to live to be able to do the whole Bible. My research indicates that he actually realized that much earlier in going through the Exodus, that then it ultimately becomes clear in his journey, and that he has jumped to the end of the Bible to begin a commentary on Revelation, that he's not going to go past Exodus, but he goes to the end of the Bible to look at the last book of the Bible. And if you look at Apocalypse Explicata, one reason why it's so lengthy in 6 volumes is he's spending enormous amounts of times in the commentary of showing all the parts in the word where the correspondence is saying basically the same theology and the same spirituality. So retrospectively, he's showing that the whole word is always telling the same story through correspondences. That's my theory, and that then the last judgment does happen. What we know that happens in his chronology is that he sees he claims to see the last judgment happening in 1757. However, another little side comment is he's still keeping his diary. And so and that's 6 volumes of this diary that wasn't even known to exist for several decades until after his death, that now is published in 5 volumes. It's a really long, it's a 17-year diary that he kept where he's talking about his inner experiences, and they're wild. You can see a lot of stuff going on in the diary that makes it clear that that the kinds of things that he talks about later in the last judgment as happening in experiences that he's having in the spiritual world with these dramatic repositionings of communities. And then we know that, but the diary, he doesn't really quite, he never explicitly says, oh, by the way, folks, the Last Judgment is going down right now. He never makes a claim in a clear way like that in his diary, but we do know that that he rapidly finishes the Arcana and moves into 1758 for the quick publishing of several works, 5 works, the big one being Heaven and Hell, but then these 4 smaller ones that are all what we call derivative of the Arcana. He's pulling forth topical discourse that he's been working on, and one of those is the Last Judgment, and it's an accomplished fact. So that's a little backdrop on his personal journey. This working on the Explicata in a massive way. He acted like he was planned to publish it in 1759. That was his prediction. At whatever time he stopped writing is unclear, but that's the date on the title page. And a lot of people assume that he worked on it all the way up to 1759. I don't think he did. And I have reasons for saying that. So now with all of that drama set up, let's go back to Swedenborg's writing desk. He's working on the book of Revelation. He's been going verse by verse with really lengthy commentary. The book of Revelation has 22 chapters. Where does Swedenborg throw down his pen? Well, we hear him say one thing, by the way. The one comment that he ever makes about the book he never published comes at the end of a spiritual experience story that's in his 1768 work, Conjugal Love, or what's now being called Marriage Love in the New Century Edition. And after a long memorabilia, a long story, he has these memorable relations. He has these spiritual stories that he appends to chapters in Conjugal Love. And at the end of one of these, of a very long, memorable relation, he says, "And then I heard a voice from heaven, enter into your chamber and shut the door and give your attention to the work on the apocalypse that you once commenced, and now pursue it to the end within 2 years." So he's writing this in 68. We know that he ultimately published Apocalypse Revelata, Apocalypse Revealed, in 1766. So we're assuming that he had this vision in 1764, which would be several years, at least a half a decade, since he had begun the book of Revelation. And here he is holding the book of Revelation the Apocalypse Revelata, after he's finished it, in the most famous portrait, the one that we see the most out of the numerous portraits of Swedenborg, is the one by a very famous artist named Percroft the Elder, and you can see he's holding that book. So here's what's going on when he throws his pen down. The last verse he exegetes, or the last verse he interprets in Explicata, is Revelation 19, verse 10. And that verse says, "And then I fell down at his feet," and the his feet, the his there is an angel. I fell down at his, that had been showing the prophet John, the Christian prophet John, that writes the book of Revelation, that's in the biblical canon. And I don't think, by the way, it's the Apostle John. I don't think it's the one of the 12 disciples. I'm in the group of scholars that believes there's another John that was out in Western Asia that is often called the Christian prophet John. And that is the majority opinion among scholars, but there are still some scholars who will argue that the author of the fourth gospel is the same person that wrote the book of Revelation. That doesn't really matter right now. But the author of that text, the book of Revelation, is saying, "Then I fell down at this angel's feet to worship him because of all these amazing things that he'd been shown. But he said to me, 'You must not do that. I am a fellow servant with you and your brothers who hold to the testimony of Jesus. Worship God, for the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. That's the last verse that he deals with in Explicata. So here's the verse where he throws down his pen. Then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he judges and makes war. So it's the rider on the white horse, where Swedenborg says, has some kind of engagement with this text and tosses his pen down and says, wait a second, wait a second, wait a second. I think he sees that he's writing double with the rider on the white horse. Why? Let's take a look at what's happening with 1910. He doesn't change on 1910, really. 1910 in the Explicata, he's explaining that all adoration goes to God. And he's making a clear distinction between a powerful angel and the one who guides all angels, which is the Lord. And in Revelation Unveiled, that basic interpretation of 1910 continues. So he doesn't really, 1910 doesn't change very much. What does he then say in Revelata about 1911? So, and I saw heaven, this is George Dole's translation, by the way, which is not yet published. And I saw heaven opened, and look. So then he's interpreting that piece. A white horse means the spiritual meaning of the word unveiled by the Lord. And by this means a disclosure of a deeper understanding of the word, which is the advent or the second coming of the Lord. That's what 1911 is about. It's the whole coming of the spiritual sense of the word that God is unveiling and revealing, that had been obscured until this moment in time, when now it is time to unveil the long obscured meaning of the last book of the biblical canon, because what that book is talking about is going down now, and it's all about the last judgment, and that last judgment brings forth this deeper understanding of the word. So Swedenborg realized that he was riding double with the Lord on the white horse, and he then produces the white horse as one of those 1758 derivative works. So fairly powerful. It's a fairly powerful reason to throw his pen down. Once you dig into a deep study comparing the two and looking at what's going on with Swedenborg, it seems clear to understand why he set aside Explicata. So I think it's very interesting, a little commentary on Revelation Unveiled in the story of the writings as we've carried forth with it in the history of the new church. Swedenborg believed it was a very important work. You can see that he dramatizes the coming of it by saying in 1768 that he was told to go back and finish it. He has a dramatic new reading of what's going on in the book of Revelation. There's a huge shift from the universal church to the new church. There's a lot of spiritual world descriptions of what the life is like on the other side, in much more compelling ways than was true in Explicata. And so it follows alongside with Heaven and Hell as one of the two books that's kind of the mother lode of detailed intelligence regarding what the afterlife is like. However, Heaven and Hell becomes his runaway bestseller. At the Swedenborg Foundation, we estimate that it's something like 250 times more popular in its reception history than any other part of the writings. Heaven and Hell is far, far more read and deep, and it's a far more exciting book. It's far more engaging than any of the other of the works and the writings. Swedenborg, we talk about the Green 30 and all of the books of the writings, but we can say this: he has 7 major works, 7. The rest are minor works. What are the 7 major works? We can go chronologically: Arcana Celestia, Heaven and Hell, Divine Love and Wisdom, Divine Providence, Apocalypse Revealed, Conjugal Love, and True Christianity. These are his major works. And of the major works, Revelation Unveiled or Apocalypse Revealed is the least read today of the major works. It's not nearly as popular. He thought he needed to, it's common for me as someone who's been working on the BOR. I've had the comment quite a few times. People are disappointed that he set aside Apocalypse Explained because it's a lot more interesting than Apocalypse Revealed. But Swedenborg, and there's a reason why Apocalypse Revealed is the least read. So Apocalypse Explained talks mostly about the qualities of spirituality, but Apocalypse Revealed centralizes the Last Judgment and lays out the apocalypse as a judgment against Roman Catholicism and a judgment against the Protestant traditions, the old churches, and that it's all about a new church arising and replacing the old churches. I call it the axial volume of the Apocalypse Revealed is the axial volume of Swedenborg's writings, because it's there that he makes this big shift towards the end. He's getting to be quite elderly, by the way. Very soon, he's going to be in the only heresy trial that ever happened in Sweden. And so after Conjugal Love, which was an interesting sidetrack kind of book for him to do, he moves into True Christianity. He has a little summary ramp-up work called Brief Exposition that looks at, it's kind of a doctrinal overview of theology. And then he writes his great Summa, the 2-volume True Christianity. And what he's doing there is he's naming names. You can find him criticizing people like Martin Luther and John Calvin early in their writings, but extremely rarely. His increase of naming names, people who got it wrong, people who are in hellish states: John Calvin, Martin Luther, Zinzendorf, Melanchthon, Beza. He's naming names. These are traditions that got it wrong, and there was a last judgment on them, and there's a new church that's replacing all of that. Well, in today's spirituality sensibilities, that's not something we really want to talk about, right? So people are uncomfortable with the slamming of real world denominations. And especially in convention, we try to be ecumenical and interfaced. And in fact, there was a time in Swedenborg Foundation publishing history where George Dole was playing with his new translations, and we did the Last Judgment. So when he starts this critique of real world traditions in the Last Judgment in 1758, and where there's naming names, and there was a volume, it's probably in the back of the room there at the assembly, called The Last Judgment in Retrospect. And it was George Dole doing a new translation of The Last Judgment, but he excises chapter 9. And then we have an explanation at the front of that book of why we are actually not publishing. We're actually taking something out of Swedenborg because it's offensive to include it. And it was the chapter on Roman Catholicism. And there's an explanation in the preface of why he was done that. So I call Revelation Unveiled the axial volume, because it's at that point that he begins focusing on the history of the world and what's going on with his own life and work, and the unveiling of the inner sense of the word, and the need to kind of close a whole era on the Christian church and open up a new era. We might remember that in my first lecture, I doubt anybody would remember this, but the lecture, the lecture I gave last week, one of the lectures I gave last week laid out from in Bill Woofenen's work that in the actual themes and topics of the inner sense of the arcana, one of them was the history of the world. That's his famous 5 churches, right? He looks at the human sphere, but not on the level of personal regeneration. That's one of the topics of the inner sense. The other human part of the 4 topical lines of thought in the biblical exegesis is about human history in large, and that's the epics. What happens with the axial volume is he really comes out of the closet in terms of hammering the old church. And so he's on his way after Revelata to true Christianity. And by the time he begins true Christianity in 1751 is, and he's only a year away from his death, is that he is doing a doctrinal analysis of the old church versus the new church, and he's in his heresy trial. He's thick in his heresy trial, and true Christianity goes doctrinally. He deals with several doctrinal statements that are the classic Lutheran systematic. If you look at a Lutheran systematic as a topical doctrinal organized text, true Christianity is set up like that. Every chapter says, this is what the old church says, and this is what the new church says. So the axial volume of Revelata is Swedenborg coming out of the closet, ferociously making a claim that the Lord is turning the page on the Christian church. The era of the Christian church as the 4th church is being closed down, and the new church is rising up, and that's the inner sense of the apocalypse. And the new church will be this lasting phase of the church, the 5th church. And of course, the correspondence to 5 is sufficient, a sufficient number. It is the reigning epic of the church. All right, I'm going to quit that, but I'm going to go back to this kind of fun slide here. It's kind of fun synchronicity. Swedenborg wasn't the only person thinking there's something up about the book of Revelation in his own time. Of course, in my opinion, a very significant sort of scientist, even if he's on the margins. 2 other scientists of whom he was aware, and very much aware, especially of Isaac Newton, but even Joseph Priestley. These were scientists as well who had a whole spiritual mystical side of their life. Priestley, great chemist, becomes the leading theorist for the new Unitarian Church, the Unitarian Church movement. Swedenborg has his own Unitarian approach to the Trinity, but whereas Priestley demotes Jesus out of the Godhead, and that is just a human figure, Swedenborg elevates Jesus of Nazareth as really God in a human form. And then Isaac Newton, they both wrote on the book of Revelation as having secret codes. And I just think that's sort of an interesting factoid. And so my concluding remark is that I do think there's a lot of beautiful theology in Revelation Unveiled. Typically, Swedenborgians will mostly focus on the Holy City language, as if it's going to be used in sermons and churches. This is almost always where the text is used, and his correspondences of the Holy City, I think, is one of the most beautiful statements in Swedenborgian spirituality. that speaks about why the new church really is a universal church. It gets back to the precepts of what is love and what is the means to love, which is wisdom. And how does that get acted out through the hands in terms of usefulness and good deeds, and having a deep love of having goodness reign throughout the entire community of beings. So there's a lot of great spirituality to bring forth out of Revelata, even though it's the least read of the major works these days. And to me is in some ways one of the more powerful places to do spirituality of the inner sense of the word. So are we also riding double with the Lord on the white horse? What does it mean for us as a tradition that we continue to be committed to this inner sense of this biblical text that is still the most studied book in the history of the planet? There's no other Christian denomination today that entertains anything remotely close to the biblical text being written and to be read primarily on its inner meaning. The literal meaning in the Swedenborgian sense always contains enough truth for salvation, but it's just was his words, basis and containment for this enormous, immense inner mansion of meaning about the spiritual life. So what is our future now at this time in our history on this white horse? And with that, I will see if we have a few questions before we maybe break. And Rudy or somebody type into the chat what Gardner says.
Right, he doesn't have closed caption. So, hi, Jim. Great. This is Gard Perry. Hey, wonderful talk. Thank you so much, Jim, for your scholarly offering and the work you've done over really many, many years and soon to be published, and illuminating ideas for us here at the Assembly. So first of all, thank you very much. So listen, there's a conundrum came up for me at the very end of your talk, so that's easy to handle. You expressed in no uncertain terms that the revelation unveiled is Swedenborg's late expression that there's going to be a new church which supersedes the Christian church. So it is the Christian church as he knew it, and there's going to be a conundrum here, and I'm asking you, how do you solve it? He's writing at a time when he's claiming that the Christian church is over and that there's a new church on the face of the globe for all people. Post-Christian is the way I hear it. And yet, in a closing slide, you will ask the question, how do we as a Christian denomination handle this idea? And where are we going in the future? So in other words, I'll just frame it my way as a question to you. It's clear that Swedenborg is talking about a post-Christian era in 1770, in 1768. And yet today we are still talking about ourselves as a Christian denomination. How do you solve that dilemma, conundrum? What's your solution to that puzzle?
Well, so you're making kind of a comment, right?
I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Yes, well, yes, it is kind of a comment, but I mean,
Swedenborg believes the new church is a Christian church, right?
Oh, okay. That
But
makes sense.
what was being closed down was a Christian church era that was riddled with so many problematic theological errors that it had lost its power to be salvific. And so he has his criticisms theologically of what becomes standard theology throughout the major branches of Christianity were not small problems. So he's trying to correct understandings of who the Lord is, how does salvation and regeneration happen, and what is how should we understand the Lord, and how should we understand the way we live and what the destiny of humanity is. So it's still a Christian era. You know, I'll just make the additional comment that when I was reading Apocalypse Revealed back in college in Texas, and it would be 2 years before I ever met a Swedenborgian. I was sitting as I grew up mainline, and it had an atheistic sojourn for a couple of years, and then come back kind of powerfully through some personal experiences that there was a something more option. And Swedenborg was one of the authors I found in that first year of immersion, and he started moving to the foreground. And as I read Swedenborg more and more, I was thinking, wow, he won all of his arguments, because I didn't know anybody who believed really in faith alone, that faith alone would save you without works. I didn't know anybody believed that. I didn't know anybody believed that there were three gods. I now understand that you can find people who situate themselves in some ways in those categories. But what I'm testifying to here is that the Christian world I knew would have been happy with Swedenborg's critique of a lot of the history of Christian theology. And so when I began exploring the new church, when I learned that there was actually a denomination based on these books, and I began talking to the branches, I would say the single most important, emotionally, the moment that stands out to me, even though the convention was way ahead, because all of those conversations were fun and exciting, and the conversations I was having with other branches were more stilted and less comfortable, and I just did not have a sense of immediate community. And convention had been very organic and natural for me. But I'll never forget, on that particular question, it was important to me that one of the branches I talked to was very ecumenical. And the other branch told me, no, we don't do that because that's part of the old vastated church. And that by itself was so odd to me that I knew what that meant, but they were acting like it was still a quarter millennium ago. And I felt like the New Age had been having its effect in the world, and that there were a lot of Christians who were responding to evolutionary waves of thought that were in many ways consistent with the direction of spirituality where Swedenborg was going. So I thought it was very peculiar to consider all of these people I knew as part of the old vastated church, because I felt there had been renovations in thought in much of Christianity. So that's just a side comment of a personal experience around being Christian, and what does the new church mean around the word Christian.
Okay, thank you, Jim. That's a clear explication to me of how you solve that problem, and I appreciate your answer. See, we have a couple minutes. Well, I could throw another idea out. Well, no, I'm going to surrender to Hugh. We only have a couple of minutes, so this is Hugh Odner, who's coming in with a question. Just a couple minutes left.
Actually, it's more of a comment. And hi, Jim.
Right into the mic.
Yes. Um, what I'm delighted in hearing is the research that is going on. When you mentioned things like, well, certain things, for example, in True Christian Religion, that Swedenborg names names which weren't so, he didn't do so much earlier. And he got very specific on countering what I would call the old Christian faith. I was delighted to hear that that type of research is still going on, because normally I'm not hearing too much about the research that used to take place, I would say back in the 1800s, which Gard was talking about as being the golden age, which I tended to agree with. So thank you.
Okay, that was a comment from Hugh Odner, and also we are now up to time, so I'll take the honor of saying thank you very, very much, Jim, for being with us. I presume you can be with us for the discussion period that starts in 10 minutes? Great. And here's a hand.